One dress forced millions of women to soil themselves in silence. Picture this: the glamorous Victorian ballrooms of London filled with chandeliers blazing and gowns so wide they could block a doorway. Behind the silk and lace, however, was a nightmare no one dared speak of. These dresses weren't just fashion, they were cages. Cages so enormous and complicated that women sometimes went days without removing them. But here's the disturbing part. When nature called, there was no polite excuse, no privacy, no escape. Sometimes they relieved themselves where they stood, inside contraptions hidden beneath their skirts. Devices so humiliating and unhygienic they caused infections, fainting, even death. Imagine trying to dance, flirt, and maintain perfect grace while urine or worse collected in a pouch tied to your thigh. How is this even possible? How could an entire society force half its population to suffer such degrading, dangerous routines while pretending everything was elegant? Stay with me, because in the next 30 minutes we'll uncover the awful truth about Victorian toilets, the bizarre contraptions women used under their gowns, and the deadly consequences of beauty and modesty gone too far. But this nightmare didn't start there. It began in a place so innocent no one saw the horror coming. To understand how Victorian women ended up trapped in dresses so cumbersome they sometimes had to relieve themselves inside them, we need to step back to 19th century Britain, a world of breathtaking contrasts. London in the mid-1800s was a city of wealth and filth, glittering palaces standing only streets away from overflowing cesspools. Gas lamps lit the avenues where horse-drawn carriages rattled, their wheels spattering mud mixed with animal waste. The Thames itself had become a dark ribbon of sewage, so foul that even Parliament once had to suspend sessions because of the unbearable stench. Yet amid this chaos, society clung desperately to an idea of refinement, elegance, and control. Nowhere was this obsession more visible than in women's fashion. Victorian gowns were marvels of engineering as much as clothing. With crinolines, bustles, and layers of silk, a single dress could weigh more than 15 pounds and stretch over 6 feet wide. They were designed not for comfort, but for spectacle, living sculptures that proclaimed a family's wealth and a woman's supposed virtue. But here's the cruel irony. The very gowns meant to display purity and refinement left women with almost no practical way to perform the most basic human act, using the toilet. Modesty was the supreme law of the Victorian woman. Even the word toilet was often considered indecent. Euphemisms like necessary, closet, or retiring room were whispered in place of blunt honesty. For many respectable women, even mentioning bodily functions risked scandal. Now imagine trying to excuse yourself from a dinner hosted by nobility while wearing a gown so massive it couldn't fit through narrow corridors or down a servant's stairwell. Even if you could reach the chamber pot, removing layers of corsetry and petticoats could take half an hour and required help from a maid. Privacy, in other words, was impossible. Let's place ourselves in the shoes of a young debutante. Let's call her Clara Whitmore. Clara grew up in a wealthy London townhouse, raised to believe that elegance was survival. Every morning, her maid laced her into a corset so tight she could barely breathe, then stacked petticoats and hoops until her silhouette became a bell-shaped cage. From the outside, she looked like the perfect Victorian lady, but inside she was learning a truth whispered among women and never spoken. Aloud. Once the dress was on, your body was no longer your own. If you needed relief during a ball, you might be forced to use a device strapped between your legs, something called a lady's convenience or portable urinal. It was humiliating. It was dangerous, but it was considered normal. Doctors of the time noticed troubling symptoms in women of high society: frequent fainting, infections, even kidney damage. Yet these illnesses were often dismissed as female hysteria, a vague diagnosis that blamed women's weakness instead of their suffering. A few sharp observers raised alarms. Writers and reformers like Florence Nightingale and sanitary engineer Edwin Chadwick documented the connection between poor hygiene and disease. But few dared link this issue to women's fashion directly, because criticizing the dress meant criticizing the very symbol of Victorian morality. Still, there were whispers. Some women collapsed at balls after holding their bladder too long. Others suffered infections after using crude, portable contraptions made of tin or leather, hidden under their skirts. And every so often, a scandalous story leaked into gossip columns about women who soiled themselves during church services or royal events. But here's where things get even stranger. Hidden in private diaries and medical journals are references to an invention most people today have never heard of. A device so bizarre, so humiliating, that many historians refuse to discuss it. It was marketed as a way for women to relieve themselves discreetly during society functions without leaving the room. How did it work? Why was it so dangerous? And why has history tried to erase it? To fully grasp the nightmare, consider the setting where all this unfolded. Picture a Victorian ballroom, gilded ceilings, string quartets, couples gliding across polished floors. Now imagine that beneath those shimmery gowns, half the women in the room were silently wrestling with bladder pain, strapped into contraptions that might spill at any moment. Or think of a long railway journey across Britain. Men could step outside to smoke, drink, or use rough station toilets, but women in crinolines were trapped in their compartments for hours, often resorting to bottles or bags hidden beneath their skirts. These humiliations weren't accidents. They were the natural result of a society that prized appearances over reality, modesty over health, and silence over truth. Imagine being Clara Whitmore, dancing at her first royal ball, knowing she might soil herself before the night ended. Imagine being a maid tasked with secretly emptying a pouch of urine strapped to your mistress's leg. Imagine the shame of infection or odor, while still being forced to smile and curtsy as if nothing was wrong. Each of these small humiliations planted seeds of suffering that grew into something far darker. The world saw beauty and grace. Behind closed doors, women endured humiliation, illness, and danger. But the worst was yet to come. Because once Victorian society found a way to systematize this hidden cruelty, it became a silent epidemic that affected millions. Hit subscribe if you want to see how this innocent beginning turns into history's darkest nightmare. And tell me, do you think you would have recognized the evil early? What happened next should have been a warning to everyone. Victorian society was built on silence. People did not speak of sex, childbirth, or bathroom needs, and yet, in private, these very topics defined daily existence. Nowhere was this contradiction more visible than in the cruel dance between fashion and biology. The first whispers of trouble came from the grand events that defined upper-class life. Imagine a candlelit ballroom in 1856, hundreds of guests gathered beneath glittering chandeliers. The women's skirts were so wide they filled the room like floating ships. But one night, as a young woman curtsied to her host, she suddenly collapsed. Witnesses described her face turning pale, her body trembling. Doctors rushed forward, assuming she'd fainted from a tight corset, but the truth, she had been holding her bladder for nearly 10 hours. When her body could no longer endure, she collapsed in agony, and humiliation followed when attendants discovered the mess hidden beneath her skirts. No one dared speak of it openly, but gossip travelled fast. And though society laughed it off as female weakness, it was a warning sign that fashion was pushing women's bodies to the breaking point. Rail travel was the pride of the age. For men, it meant adventure. For women, it meant entrapment. On one recorded journey from London to Edinburgh, a woman reportedly used a portable convenience, a tin funnel attached to a pouch, beneath her gown while sitting upright in the carriage. Her maid, horrified, later confessed in her diary that the contraption leaked, soaking the silk layers of the dress. The humiliation was silent but devastating. The lady refused to be seen in public for weeks afterward. Yet this wasn't an isolated case. Newspapers of the time occasionally hinted at ladies' accidents on the rails, though never in explicit detail. Behind the euphemisms was a harsh truth. Travel for women was a gauntlet of fear and embarrassment. Even queens were not immune. Court rumours whispered that ladies in waiting sometimes carried cloth pouches known as urinals strapped to their thighs during long ceremonies. Servants were tasked with secretly disposing of them afterward. One courtier later recalled the stench that sometimes lingered in the halls after hours-long banquets. He never dared say the word urine, but his memoir spoke cryptically of unpleasant vapours clinging to the air from beneath the lady's go. WNS. It was a secret everyone pretended not to notice. By the 1860s, inventors spotted a market. Advertisements began to appear, discreetly of course, for devices marketed as ladies' travelling necessaries. These ranged from porcelain cups with rubber tubing to leather bags strapped between the thighs. They were sold in hushed tones at apothecaries or through coded mail-order catalogues. A woman might request a personal article for delicate health and be handed a contraption designed not to heal but to humiliate. But these devices had serious flaws. They leaked, they caused rashes and infections, and they were nearly impossible to clean discreetly. Some women suffered urinary tract infections so severe that doctors mistakenly believed they were venereal diseases. Still, because discussing the truth was unthinkable, the suffering continued behind a veil of silence. Maidservants were the hidden witnesses to this nightmare. They were the ones who helped lace the gowns, who cleaned the stained linens, who carried away the foul-smelling pouches. In some cases, they were even forced to kneel beneath their mistress's skirts during a ball, discreetly holding a porcelain chamber in place while the lady relieved herself standing up. Imagine the humiliation, for mistress and servant alike. Yet it became a whispered routine in many wealthy households. Outwardly, the Victorian lady was the picture of grace. She glided across rooms, never breaking composure, never admitting to the human needs her body demanded. But behind the scenes, her reality was soaked in secrecy, pain and shame, and society enabled it. Men congratulated themselves on women's modesty, without ever asking how that modesty was maintained. Medical journals documented women's fainting spells but rarely connected them to urinary retention or infection. The culture preferred mystery over truth. Perhaps the darkest turning point came in 1863 when a London hospital quietly recorded the death of a 22-year-old woman from sepsis. The cause? A bladder infection gone untreated, worsened by repeated use of a foul portable urinal device. But the official record did not name the device. Instead, it blamed hysteria and nervous disposition. In other words, the system covered it up. The young woman's death was erased by euphemism, her suffering hidden to preserve the illusion of Victorian decency. And this wasn't the only case. Diaries and letters hint at dozens of similar tragedies, women sickened, weakened, or even killed by infections directly linked to the bizarre toilet practices their clothing forced upon them. Each decade, the gowns grew more elaborate. The crinolines of the 1850s expanded into bustles by the 1870s, creating even stranger shapes that made traditional toilets nearly impossible. In response, the contraptions grew more extreme. One invention used a leather tube leading into a small flask strapped at the calf. Another resembled a miniature chamber pot that fit between the thighs, its contents sloshing with every movement. Each new solution only created more problems. Women suffered not only physically but psychologically, haunted by the constant fear of odor, leakage, or discovery. When scandals broke, society scrambled to bury them. Newspapers that hinted at accidents were censored or softened. Families paid servants hush money. Doctors disguised the causes of death with vague diagnoses. The Victorian obsession with appearances made it impossible to confront the truth. But the rumours spread anyway, and each rumour carried the same chilling hue. End of tune. The gowns weren't just fashion, they were prisons. But everything we've seen so far was just practice. The fainting, the leaks, the infections, these were the opening notes of a symphony of suffering. The real horror was about to begin, because soon, this silent humiliation became systematized. It moved from isolated accidents to a normalized system of suffering, an epidemic that touched millions. From this point on, there was no humanity left, only pure evil. By the 1870s, Victorian fashion had reached its most extreme. Dresses ballooned into bizarre architectural shapes, bustles jutting like scaffolds, skirts so wide they brushed doorframes. The clothing wasn't just heavy, it was restrictive, locking women's bodies into rigid postures, and beneath it all, a horrifying new normal had taken hold. What began as improvised solutions, maids holding chamber pots, women strapping on makeshift pouches, soon evolved into an organized industry. Manufacturers began producing ladies' conveniences at scale. Entire catalogues quietly offered porcelain funnels, leather tubes, and metal flasks disguised as perfume bottles. Doctors even endorsed them as necessary sanitary arrangements for the modern woman, never acknowledging the risks. Suddenly, it wasn't just the elite suffering these contraptions. Middle-class women began using them too. The system had grown from scattered humiliation into a silent epidemic. This new solution spread everywhere. Railway stations sold traveling necessaries to anxious women before long journeys. Department stores marketed them as symbols of refinement, because a lady who never excused herself was considered more dignified. Schools for girls sometimes required students to practice walking in bustles while balancing hidden pouches, conditioning them for their future roles. Within a decade, millions of women across Britain and Europe were livitauds. With these humiliations daily, some of the devices were grotesque. Porcelain urinal shaped to fit under the skirts, with a spout that drained into a flask strapped to the calf. The flask often leaked. A rubber tubing system that funneled waste into a leather pouch at the hip. If the tubing bent or twisted, the system overflowed. A cloth portable commode, a padded cushion with a hole and hidden bag that women wore while sitting, forcing them to soil themselves in silence. These contraptions weren't luxuries, they were cages disguised as solutions. One chilling case appeared in a private letter from 1874. A newlywed bride fainted during her reception. Family members later admitted she had been too terrified to excuse herself during the hours-long ceremony, wearing a gown so rigid it took 3 maids to remove. Instead, she relied on a hidden pouch. It ruptured during the first dance, soaking the floor. Ashamed, she withdrew from society, never attending another ball. Her humiliation was buried in whispers, but her suffering was real. Middle-class and working women weren't spared. One factory girl from Manchester was discovered wearing a makeshift pouch tied with rags beneath her skirt. Her supervisor mocked her publicly when it leaked. She later developed an infection that forced her to quit work altogether. The tragedy? She had improvised the device because factory owners didn't allow women breaks during shifts. The system of humiliation wasn't just social, it was economic. A governess in Yorkshire kept a diary describing her secret shame. On long carriage rides with her employers, she was forced to use a lady's convenience while seated among the family, pretending nothing was happening. I wept silently, she wrote, but to excuse myself would have been more shameful still. Her story reveals the psychological torture. Women weren't only enduring physical pain, they were being trained to erase their humanity, forced to act as if I were machines of elegance rather than human beings. How did this cruelty spread unchecked? Because it was enforced by networks of enablers, designers who built gowns knowing the restrictions, doctors who ignored symptoms or blamed female weakness, husbands who demanded their wives appear elegant at all times, mothers who trained their daughters to accept humiliation as normal, servants who, though suffering themselves, helped maintain the illusion. Each enabler added a brick to the wall of silence, and every woman trapped inside paid the price. There were attempts to resist, A few reformers pushed for rational dress, simpler clothing that allowed freedom of movement. Some women tried bloomers or loose gowns, but they were mocked mercilessly. Newspapers ridiculed mannish women who abandoned crinolines. Society shamed them back into conformity. Even Queen Victoria dismissed the movement, calling bloomers indecent. With such powerful opposition, the rebellion collapsed. As the 1870s gave way to the 1880s, the crisis deepened. 1878, a cluster of infections was reported in a London hospital, traced to poorly cleaned urinals. 1881, at least 2 deaths were quietly recorded from sepsis linked to bladder complications. 1884, reports of fainting fits at railway stations became so common they earned a euphemism, the traveller's weakness. Year after year, the problem grew, normalised by silence. The nightmare wasn't confined to Britain. Across Europe and even in America, the same pattern appeared. French salons buzzed with gossip about les commodités cachées. American department stores sold travelling devices to ladies boarding trains west. The empire of humiliation had gone global. Why did women endure this? Because society had weaponized modesty. To admit suffering was shameful. To speak of bodily needs was vulgar. Silence became survival. Psychologists today would call it internalized oppression, a system where victims police themselves. Victorian women became complicit in their own suffering, forced to choose between dignity and health. Most chose silence. Each woman believed she was alone. Each thought her shame unique. But in reality, millions were enduring the same humiliation hidden behind lace and silk. The silence was the system, and once silence became the norm, the system grew unstoppable. If you think you've heard the worst of it, I need to warn you. What comes next will change how you see humanity forever, because there came a moment, a single horrifying turning point, when this silent humiliation crossed into something much darker, a moment when the world could no longer pretend everything was fine, and that moment shattered every boundary between civilization and savagery. Then came the moment that shattered every boundary between civilization and savagery. For decades, Victorian society had managed to keep the nightmare hidden, burying accidents under euphemisms, disguising deaths as female weakness, but silence can only hold so long. In the mid-1880s, the system cracked wide open. It happened at one of London's grandest venues, a royal charity ball attended by the highest families in the empire. Hundreds of women in gowns, shaped like inverted chandeliers, glided through the halls. The evening was a display of wealth and power, until disaster struck. A young aristocratic woman collapsed mid-dance. Witnesses at first assumed she had fainted from the